My name is Abigail Carter. I'm 31 years old, and last summer my grandmother gave me $200,000 to pay off my student loans and buy my first home. But I never saw a single cent. At her birthday dinner in front of everyone, she dropped a question that froze me in place and turned the entire night upside down. Minutes later, police officers would be stepping into the backyard, and my family would realize some truths can't be hidden. If it were you, what would you do when the truth was laid bare in front of everyone? It was the kind of humid summer evening in July when the air felt thick enough to drink. I pulled up in front of my parents' house in the quiet suburbs of Providence, Rhode Island, my hands tight on the steering wheel even though I'd been parked for a full minute. The porch light was already on, the golden glow spilling across the front steps like an unspoken invitation I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. Inside, I could hear bursts of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and somewhere the familiar hum of my grandmother's voice. I stepped out of the car, smoothed the skirt of my navy dress, and took a deep breath. My sandals clicked lightly against the brick walkway, and with every step my stomach tightened. Birthdays in this family had always been complicated, but this was a milestone. My grandmother, Margaret Thompson, was turning 82. No matter what tensions swirled between my parents, my sister, and me, I wasn't going to miss it. The moment I opened the door, the smell of roasted chicken, buttered rolls, and my mother's famous lemon bars hit me. A chorus of happy birthday erupted from the dining room, followed by the creak of chairs as people stood to greet me. My mother, Linda, smiled just enough to be polite, her arms only briefly wrapping around me before she moved on to refill someone's wine glass. My father, Richard, gave a quick nod from across the room, already deep in conversation with my uncle about golf. And then there was Melissa. She looked flawless as always, her blonde hair in soft waves, wearing a fitted cream dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She leaned in to give me a hug, but her perfume was so strong it made my eyes water. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I told her she looked great. She said I looked tired. Grandma Margaret, on the other hand, lit up when she saw me. She was sitting at the head of the table, a small gold crown perched on her silver hair, the kind of prop only she could wear without looking ridiculous. I kissed her cheek and handed her the small box I'd wrapped in pale blue paper. She patted my hand and told me to sit beside her. As the evening went on, plates were passed around, stories retold, and polite laughter filled the air. I tried to relax, sipping iced tea while my mother poured more wine for everyone else. Melissa was in her element, talking about her latest trip to the Hamptons, showing photos on her phone to a couple of cousins. Every so often, I caught my father glancing at me, then quickly looking away. When the cake came out, candles glowing like tiny lanterns, everyone gathered around. We sang, we clapped, and Grandma made a show of closing her eyes before blowing them out. She thanked everyone for being there, then lifted her glass for a toast. I expected the usual heartfelt speech about family and health. Instead, she turned her eyes directly on me. "Abigail, how have you been enjoying the $200,000 I gave you last fall?" Her voice was clear, carrying over the quiet room. I nearly choked on my sip of tea. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" The air shifted heavier somehow. Conversations stopped. Chairs squeaked as people turned to look. She tilted her head. "The money I transferred to help you pay off your student loans and buy your first home. Back in October. I was hoping you'd tell me how you've put it to use." My pulse was suddenly in my ears. I could feel every eye on me, from my mother's cool, unreadable gaze to the slight smirk tugging at Melissa's lips. I swallowed hard. "Grandma, I never received that money." The words felt foreign as they left my mouth, but they were true. I had no idea what she was talking about. A murmur rippled through the room. My father's jaw tightened. My mother set her wine glass down a little too quickly. Melissa's smirk faltered just enough for me to notice. Grandma's face stayed perfectly calm, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes. "Then where is it?" she asked softly, almost to herself. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "I honestly don't know. I never saw a dime." The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. A couple of cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My uncle looked down at his plate as if it might offer an escape. My father cleared his throat, muttering something about misunderstandings. My mother forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Melissa crossed her arms. Grandma set her glass down with a soft clink. "That's strange," she said, still looking at me. "Because I have proof of where it went. And I think you'll all find it very interesting." The weight of her words hung in the air thicker than the summer heat pressing against the windows. Grandma's eyes stayed locked on mine, but in my head I was already somewhere else, slipping into the kind of memories I usually tried to keep buried. I could see the driveway of our old house when I was 16, the smell of fresh asphalt in the summer heat, and Melissa standing there grinning as Dad handed her the keys to a brand new silver Jeep. She was 17, still in high school, and barely had her permit, but it was presented like she had earned it somehow. I remembered the way Mom fussed over her, talking about how she deserved something nice to start her senior year. My own first car had been a used Honda Civic with over 100,000 miles on it, bought with money I made working 2 part-time jobs. I had been proud of it, but I also remembered the quiet sting I felt that day. Through high school and into college, the pattern never really changed. When Melissa wanted to start an online boutique during her sophomore year, Dad wrote her a check without hesitation. He even helped her set up a small studio in the basement, painted the walls a soft pink, bought her professional lighting. I was already at Northeastern University by then, buried under student loans, juggling tutoring sessions and weekend shifts at a cafe just to keep up with tuition and rent. I had asked once cautiously if they could help me with a semester's fees. Mom had said things were tight that year. A week later, Melissa posted photos of her new clothing line on Instagram, complete with imported fabrics and designer labels. Back then, I told myself it wasn't my business. She had always been into fashion, and if that was how my parents wanted to support her, so be it. I kept my head down, focused on graduating, and told myself my independence was something to be proud of. Still, I couldn't help noticing the little things. The way Melissa always seemed to have the latest designer bag, even when she mentioned her store was slow. The sudden weekend getaways to Miami, the glossy nails, the champagne brunches. I chalked it up to her priorities being different from mine. I didn't want to be the sister who kept score. There was one night during my junior year when I came home for Thanksgiving break. Melissa had just returned from some pop-up fashion event in Los Angeles. She swept into the house wearing a silk trench coat the color of cream, the kind you see in shop windows on Newbury Street, with a price tag that makes you swallow twice. I remember asking her if her business was finally turning a profit. She laughed, said something about brand image being more important than numbers in the early years, and then disappeared into her room. I let it go. I had exams to study for and a part-time shift to make. Even after graduation, the imbalance stayed the same. I landed my first job in Boston, working long hours in a small marketing firm, trying to chip away at my loans. Melissa's boutique went through rebranding more times than I could count, but the money for new launches always seemed to appear. Once I even overheard my parents talking about helping her with rent for a studio space downtown. Mom said it was an investment in her future. When I asked if they could help me with a down payment on a small condo, they told me I should wait until I had saved more on my own. I didn't push back. Maybe I should have. But family dynamics can feel like old furniture in a room, worn into place so deeply that even if they are uncomfortable, you stop noticing. I had learned to navigate around the favoritism to avoid conversations that left me feeling small. The truth was, I wanted peace more than I wanted fairness. Now, sitting at that birthday table with the weight of Grandma's words in the air, I felt those old moments pressing against me. I could see Melissa across from me, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her expression carefully neutral. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom kept glancing between us, her lips pressed tight. A cousin tried to lighten the mood by asking about the cake, but the tension was already threaded too tightly through the room. Grandma finally leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the stem of her glass, and the conversation limped back into safer topics. Someone started talking about the Red Sox. Melissa laughed at something and Uncle said. I smiled when I was supposed to, but my mind stayed elsewhere. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and most of the guests had left, I stood by the coat rack, waiting for my turn to say goodbye to Grandma. She was busy talking to an old family friend, her hands animated, but every so often she glanced over at me. When she finally came to hug me, her voice was low, meant only for me. "We'll talk soon, Abby." I nodded, unsure what she meant, but the look in her eyes told me this wasn't over. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the crickets humming in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that all those little signs I had ignored for years were about to come crashing into the present. The next afternoon, the summer heat clung to the air like it had no intention of leaving. I pulled into my parents' driveway just as the last few relatives were arriving for the second half of Grandma's birthday celebration. It was supposed to be a casual barbecue in the backyard, the kind where the smell of grilled corn and ribs mingles with the sound of kids chasing each other across the lawn. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was different. Conversations were quieter, eyes darted from one person to another, and Grandma Margaret stood near the dining room table with a stillness that cut through the noise. She cleared her throat and the murmurs died instantly. Her gaze landed on my father. "Richard," she said evenly, "I think it's time we talk about what happened to the $200,000 I gave Abby last year." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the clinking of glasses fading into silence. Dad adjusted the collar of his polo shirt, giving a small dismissive laugh. "Oh, Mom, this really isn't the time. We're celebrating your birthday. Let's not drag business into it." Linda, my mother, busied herself with rearranging a tray of cheese and crackers, her hands moving faster than necessary. Melissa sat on the edge of the sofa, one leg crossed over the other, her nails tapping against her phone. She didn't look up. Grandma's voice sharpened. "Then when is the time? Because I have the proof right here." She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thin manila folder. The snap of the clasp echoed louder than it should have. She laid the papers out on the table with a precision that told me she had been waiting for this moment. I stepped closer and saw the first sheet, a printed copy of a bank transfer dated the 14th of October 2022. It showed $200,000 leaving Grandma's account and landing in my father's. Next to it was a scanned copy of a signed acknowledgement. My father's name. His signature. And in the memo, line written in Grandma's careful handwriting for Abby's home purchase and student loan balance. Dad's jaw tightened. That was an investment. For the family. We needed to put that money somewhere it could grow. Grandma's voice trembled now, but not with age, with fury. "You promised me, Richard. You looked me in the eye and told me you'd get that money to Abby within the week." Melissa finally spoke, her tone casual, almost bored. "We were just trying to think long term. I mean, if Dad invested it, then it could benefit everyone." Everyone, I asked, the word slipping out before I could stop it. Because it didn't seem to include me. A few cousins shifted uncomfortably. Uncle Frank cleared his throat and said maybe it was a misunderstanding. Aunt Carol's voice rose over his, saying it sounded like theft to her. Mom set the cheese tray down with a sharp thud. "Nobody stole anything. We're a family. Families share resources." Grandma's hand flattened on the table. "Families also keep their word. What you did was not sharing. It was taking. And you took from Abby." The air snapped with tension. Dad tried to wave it off, but his face had lost its easy smile. Melissa kept her eyes on her phone, now scrolling like she could disappear into the screen. One of my younger cousins whispered to another, and the words "enough for jail" floated to my ears. I wasn't sure if they meant it literally, but my heart pounded at the possibility. Grandma gathered the papers back into the folder and tucked it under her arm. "I have already spoken to the police. They will be here shortly to take statements." A ripple went through the room. Dad's face went pale. Mom's lips parted, then closed again without a word. Melissa's head snapped up, her eyes wide for the first time that day. "You called the police?" Dad's voice cracked at the end like he couldn't believe his mother would do such a thing. "I did," Grandma said simply. "And I will tell them exactly what happened." No one moved. Outside, I could hear the hum of cicadas and the faint shouts of children playing in the yard, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside. Some relatives tried to start small talk, others stayed frozen in place. I stood by the table, my hands gripping the back of a chair, the grain of the wood pressing into my palms. For years, I had watched my parents bend the rules for Melissa, make excuses, and smooth over every bump for her. But this was different. This was money meant for me stolen without a word. The sound of a car door closing out front made the room go even quieter. Grandma didn't look at anyone as she straightened her posture, her eyes fixed on the doorway. The first shadow moved across the threshold, and I knew the moment she had promised last night was here. Two uniformed officers stepped into the backyard, their presence cutting through the humid air like a blade. Officer Karen Jenkins, tall with a calm but unshakable expression, scanned the gathering while her partner Officer Miguel Rodriguez carried a small notepad already in his hand. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and even the children's laughter from the far end of the yard faded as if the whole world had been muted. Grandma Margaret walked forward without hesitation, the manila folder tucked firmly under her arm. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said, her voice steady. "This is the documentation I told you about. $200,000 transferred to my son's account with explicit instructions that it was for my granddaughter Abby." She handed the folder to Officer Jenkins, who took it and began flipping through the pages. Dad leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed like he was at a poker table and holding a winning hand. "We're talking about family money, not a crime." Officer Rodriguez glanced up from his notes. "Sir, if these documents are accurate, this is a civil and potentially criminal matter. It depends on the intent and the use of funds. That's why we're here." Melissa's voice piped up from the sofa, soft but shaking. "I only did what Dad told me. I didn't know all the details." Grandma's head turned sharply toward her. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Linda stepped forward, tears already welling in her eyes. "Everything we've done has been for the good of this family. Abby has always been fine on her own, and Melissa, she needed more help." I could hear the rustle of judgment in the crowd. Aunt Carol's lips pressed into a thin line, and Uncle Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Officer Jenkins closed the folder and looked directly at my father. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, and Miss Carter will need to speak to each of you separately to get your statements." Dad scoffed. "Here now, yes, here and now," Jenkins replied. "It will be faster and ensure everyone's account is documented accurately." Some of the relatives began to murmur in protest. Uncle Dave called out that we didn't need police in family matters. Cousin Laura added that airing dirty laundry like this was only going to cause lasting damage. Grandma's voice cut through the noise like glass breaking. "Justice does not have a family exemption. If any of you think loyalty means protecting a lie, then you are part of the problem." The officers moved to the patio table, arranging 3 chairs spaced far enough apart to keep each person from overhearing. Officer Rodriguez gestured toward my father. "Sir, we'll start with you." Dad shot a glance at Mom, then at Melissa, before standing up slowly and walking over. He sat down with the posture of a man determined not to give an inch. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Can't we just fix this quietly?" she asked Officer Jenkins. "That's not up to me, ma'am," Jenkins said. "Our job is to document the facts." Melissa fidgeted with her bracelet, her foot tapping an uneven rhythm against the deck. I could see the color drain from her face as Rodriguez asked Dad the first question. Some of the guests began drifting toward the house, but others stayed rooted in place, unwilling to miss what was unfolding. I stood beside Grandma, who watched the scene without blinking. Her jaw was set, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. One by one, the officers called them over. Linda tried to play the role of the selfless mother, speaking through soft sobs about sacrifice and doing what was best for the family. Melissa's turn was different. She avoided eye contact, her voice clipped and defensive, repeating that she was just following instructions. From where I stood, I could see Jenkins writing steadily, her pen moving without pause. When they finished, both officers stepped aside to confer quietly. The rest of us stayed frozen in a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The air smelled faintly of charcoal from the grill, now cold and abandoned. Grandma leaned toward me and whispered so only I could hear. "No matter how this goes, Abby, you remember that you did nothing wrong." I nodded, though my stomach was tight. Watching my own family reduced to suspects in a legal matter was nothing I had ever imagined, but the clarity of the moment was undeniable. Rodriguez turned back toward the group. We have your statements, and we may have follow-up questions as we continue reviewing the documents. For now, please remain available while we process the information. The tension didn't break, but it shifted, settling into a heavy stillness that wrapped around everyone present. I could feel it pressing on my chest as the officers began gathering their notes, and the realization sank in that this was far from over. Officer Jenkins motioned toward the empty chair on the far side of the patio, away from the clusters of relatives who were now pretending to sip lemonade or scroll through their phones. I walked over, each step feeling heavier, as if the humid Boston summer air had thickened into syrup. My palms were damp against my thighs, and I had to force myself to meet her eyes when she gestured for me to sit. Officer Rodriguez flipped to a fresh page in his notebook and offered a small, neutral nod. "We just need to get your side," he said, his voice calm but expectant. "Start with your situation before October last year." I told them about the years after graduating from Northeastern University, the weight of student loans that seemed to follow me into every decision I made. I described working 60 hours a week, splitting my life between my marketing job at a mid-size firm in Cambridge and weekend shifts at a bookstore just to make ends meet. Vacations were something other people took. I learned to stretch every grocery bill, patch up old coats instead of buying new ones, and decline social invitations when I couldn't justify the expense. Meanwhile, my parents were adding a sunroom to the Cape Cod vacation house and replacing their kitchen with imported Italian marble. I kept telling myself it wasn't my business how they spent their money. Rodriguez's pen scratched steadily across the page. "Do you have reason to believe the $200,000 from your grandmother was spent by them?" My jaw tightened. I didn't know for sure until recently, but now, yes. About $70,000 went to that Cape Cod renovation. $35,000 for a brand new SUV my father drives. $40,000 into Melissa's online clothing boutique. $15,000 on a golf club membership for both of them. And around $10,000 on luxury shopping. The list sounded even more obscene when spoken aloud. A few relatives nearby shifted uncomfortably, and I caught one cousin raising her brows at another. Rodriguez asked me to explain how I knew those numbers. I told him about overhearing Melissa brag to a friend on the phone about the best investment my parents ever made and how she had been able to order high-end inventory after a big family windfall. I remembered visiting the Cape Cod house in early spring and being told not to go out on the deck because it was still under warranty. I had spotted a fresh service sticker on the SUV's windshield from a dealership that sold nothing under luxury prices. Before Rodriguez could respond, a voice cut in from behind us. "That's not the only time they've done this. It was my Uncle David." He stepped closer, his face tight. "Back in 2017, they borrowed $60,000 from me with a promise to pay it back in a year. I only ever saw 30. The reaction was immediate. Aunt Carol's mouth fell open. Two of my cousins turned toward my father, their expressions sharp and disbelieving. Linda's cheeks flushed, but she straightened in her chair. "That was different," she said firmly. "We were all investing in a family opportunity." David's laugh was humorless. "I was lied to, just like Abby." That seemed to tilt the balance in the yard. People who had been neutral murmuring small talk to avoid the mess now edged toward our side of the patio. Arms crossed, jaws set. I could feel their quiet verdict in the space between us. Rodriguez looked back at me. "Had you ever confronted them about these spending choices before today?" I shook my head. "Number," I told myself. I was overthinking. That maybe I was jealous. I figured as long as I was paying my own way, it wasn't my place to judge how they managed their finances. But now I see the pattern. Melissa's voice rose from the table, high and brittle. "You're acting like I'm some criminal. I built that store from nothing." From my chair, I saw Grandma's head turn, her voice steady and ice cold. "With my money." Melissa's lips parted, but no words came. She glanced toward our parents, searching for backup, but even they looked momentarily stunned into silence. Rodriguez asked a few more questions, his tone clinical, then asked if I could recall the exact date I learned about the missing money. I told him about the moment earlier that day, how Grandma's question in front of everyone had been the first I'd heard of any $200,000 gift. How the shock had made my ears ring and my mind scramble for an explanation that wasn't betrayal. Jenkins's pen stopped. She exchanged a quick look with Rodriguez, something unspoken passing between them before she turned toward Uncle David. "Sir, we'll need to get your statement next." I stood my knees stiff and stepped away from the chair. As I passed Grandma, her eyes met mine, and there was a glimmer there, half pride, half grief, that made my chest ache. Behind me, Uncle David's voice began recounting dates and amounts, the numbers clear and steady. More relatives were listening now, their gazes fixed on my parents. I heard my father mutter something about family loyalty under his breath, but it only seemed to draw sharper looks from the others. It struck me then that this was no longer a private wound between me and them. The truth had begun to leak into every corner of the yard, soaking into old grudges and half-forgotten disputes. The list of people they had wronged was longer than I had ever imagined, and the officers were taking down every word. I found a spot by the garden fence away from the main cluster, the scent of sun-warmed lavender drifting in the air. For the first time in years, I wasn't the only one carrying the weight of suspicion. And with every revelation, I could feel that weight shifting away from me and onto them piece by piece. Officer Jenkins' voice carried clearly across the yard, firm but not raised. "After reviewing the statements and evidence provided, we are taking Richard Carter, Linda Carter, and Melissa Carter into custody for investigation of theft and fraud." The words seemed to drop like stones into the warm air, breaking the low murmur of side conversations. Gasps and sharp intakes of breath rippled through the guests. Patricia Langford's voice rose immediately, sharp and indignant. "This is outrageous. You cannot just arrest family in the middle of a birthday celebration." Rodriguez didn't flinch. "Ma'am, please step aside." Patricia planted herself near the steps, but one look from Grandma, steady, unyielding, made her falter. Patricia's lips pressed into a tight line, and she muttered something under her breath before moving away. I could see a few guests exchanging uneasy glances, some clutching their purses as if afraid they might be asked to give statements next. Two couples quietly excused themselves, murmuring to Grandma about calling her later before slipping out through the side gate. Amy and Brian appeared at my side. Amy's hand found mine and squeezed. "You're not alone in this," she whispered. Brian nodded toward the center of the yard where the officers were stepping closer to my parents and sister. "Stay where you are." Linda's voice cracked as she began to speak. "This is a mistake. We did what we did for the family." "You can't possibly think," Rodriguez interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Mrs. Carter, please place your hands in front of you." Her eyes darted toward my father, who stood stiff and unmoving, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles twitch. He didn't speak as Jenkins stepped behind him and reached for the handcuffs. The metallic click was loud in the sudden stillness. Melissa, who had been sitting near the patio table, slowly stood. Her face was pale, the spark of defiance I had seen earlier gone. She avoided my gaze, completely staring instead at the ground. Jenkins approached her. "Miss Carter, please put your hands behind your back." Melissa's shoulders hunched, and for a moment I thought she might argue. But then her hands moved slowly behind her, and the cuffs closed with a sound that seemed to echo in my chest. Gasps came again from the edges of the gathering. I caught sight of Aunt Carol shaking her head, disbelief etched across her features. Uncle David's expression was grim, his arms folded as if he had been waiting years for this moment. Patricia started up again, her voice rising. "You cannot just parade them out like common criminals. This is humiliating." Grandma turned to her, her voice carrying over the yard with quiet authority. "This is the consequence of the choices they made." Silence followed, heavier than before. Even Patricia had no response to that. The officers began to lead them toward the gate, each of them flanked by a uniformed presence. Richard kept his chin high, Linda's eyes brimmed with unshed tears, and Melissa's hair fell forward, hiding most of her face. I stayed rooted near the garden fence, my pulse loud in my ears. Part of me wanted to look away, to spare myself the image of my own family being walked out in cuffs, but another part, deeper, harder, needed to see it. Needed to remember that after years of feeling powerless, the truth had finally pulled them into the light. Amy's hand was still wrapped around mine, her grip steady. Brian stood on my other side, his presence solid. Neither of them said a word as the gate opened and the trio was escorted through. Beyond the fence, the low rumble of police radios mixed with the distant hum of summer traffic. Neighbors had begun to gather at the edges of their lawns, curious faces turning toward the commotion. I wondered what stories they would tell later about this night. Grandma moved past me, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. She paused at the gate just long enough to look back at the remaining guests. "Thank you for coming today. The party is over." The statement was final and no one argued. Chairs scraped lightly against the patio as people began to collect their things. The faint clink of ice in abandoned glasses punctuated the quiet as the crowd thinned. I watched the taillights of the police car as it rolled down the street, disappearing into the soft glow of the street lamps. The scent of lavender was still in the air, but now it mixed with something sharper, a metallic tang that seemed to cling to the memory of the cuffs and the sound they made. As the yard emptied, Amy and Brian stayed close. Grandma was speaking quietly with Officer Jenkins near the gate, her hand resting on the folder of documents she had guarded so fiercely. I could see the slight nod from Jenkins as she took the folder, tucking it under her arm. The patio looked strangely bare without the tables of food and clusters of relatives. In their place was a quiet that felt both unsettling and necessary. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, but before you can see the full damage. I knew there would be more to face. Court dates, explanations, perhaps more revelations from other family members. But in that moment, watching the last of the guests disappear down the driveway, I felt a shift inside me. For the first time, the weight wasn't just shifting, it was lifting piece by piece, leaving room for something new to take its place. Grandma's kitchen smelled faintly of chamomile tea and the lemon bars she had wrapped in foil for me to take home. The clock above the stove ticked softly, a steady counterpoint to the storm still rolling through my mind. She moved with quiet purpose, pouring steaming water into 2 mugs before setting one in front of me. "I thought you should know how this all came together," she said, settling into the chair across from me. Her eyes were sharp, but there was warmth in them too. "This didn't happen overnight." I leaned forward, my hands wrapped around the mug. "Tell me." "8 months ago, I started noticing little things," she began. "Phone calls that ended when I walked into the room, receipts left on the counter from stores I knew you'd never shop at, and conversations about investments you supposedly made. At first I thought maybe I had just misunderstood something, but when your Uncle David mentioned what happened to him in 2017, I knew I had to dig deeper." She took a sip of tea, then continued. "I hired Franklin Pierce, a private investigator I've trusted for years. He works closely with the Suffolk County DA's office. I told him everything I suspected, every small detail I'd picked up. I pictured Franklin, a name I'd heard from Grandma before, in passing, methodical and discreet. What did he find? Everything," she said simply. "Bank records showing a transfer from my account in October last year. $200,000 labeled for you. The withdrawal was immediate, and the money was split into several accounts tied to your parents and Melissa." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the edge beneath it. "He tracked purchases too. $70,000 to renovate that Cape Cod vacation house, $35,000 for a new SUV in your father's name, $40,000 for Melissa's failing boutique. And then, well, the rest was scattered: $15,000 for a golf club membership, $10,000 for high-end shopping in New York and Paris." My stomach turned at the precision of it all. "And they thought no one would notice. They counted on me being too old to keep track," she said dryly. "And on you not asking questions." I swallowed hard. "Franklin also found photos," she went on. "Social media posts Melissa thought she'd hidden her holding handbags worth thousands, your parents smiling in front of the newly renovated vacation home, even a week-long trip to Bermuda last winter." The pieces clicked into place in my mind, matching the half-formed suspicions I had ignored. "You didn't say anything until now because I wanted to be sure," Grandma interrupted. "I wanted evidence no one could twist or dismiss. The DA's office told me the best way to make this stick was to confront them with witnesses present to ensure they couldn't quietly return the money and pretend it never happened." I thought about the way she had sat at the head of the table earlier, waiting until the perfect moment to drop her question. "So you chose your birthday?" She smiled faintly. "I knew they'd come." They like the appearance of family unity even if it's all for show. And with everyone there, the pressure would be on them. No chance to hide behind phone calls or lawyers before the police arrived. There was a weight in my chest, not the suffocating kind I'd been carrying, but something heavier with meaning. You did all this, for me. For you, yes, she said, her gaze steady on mine. But also for what this family should stand for. If we let them get away with it, then the values my parents taught me, the values I tried to pass to your father, mean nothing. Protecting you is protecting that. Her words landed with a quiet finality. I thought about every time I'd been told to just let things go to keep the peace. About the years I had convinced myself that being silent was the better path. Franklin met with the DA 3 times, she added. We went over every piece of paper, every timestamp, every photo. They were ready weeks ago, but I asked them to wait. I wanted it to be here where you could see it, where no one could claim this was done behind closed doors. I stared down at my tea, the surface rippling slightly from my trembling hands. Thank you, I whispered. She reached across the table, her hand warm over mine. You're stronger than you think, Abigail. This is just the beginning of setting things right. Outside the street was quiet, the summer night thick and still. In here, though, it felt like the air had shifted again, charged with something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. Grandma leaned back, her expression softening for the first time all evening. Finish your tea. We have a lot to discuss about what happens next. I nodded, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between us. Somewhere deep inside, the fear was loosening its grip, making room for something else entirely. The marble steps of the Suffolk County Courthouse gleamed under the morning sun as I climbed them, each one feeling heavier than the last. The air smelled faintly of car exhaust and fresh coffee from the food cart parked on the corner, but none of it cut through the knot tightening in my stomach. Inside, the cool air and hushed voices created a strange kind of pressure, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Grandma walked beside me, steady and composed, her cane tapping softly against the tile. Franklin was already waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom, flipping through a thick binder of documents. He gave me a reassuring nod, but didn't try to make small talk. When the clerk called our case, the 3 of us stepped inside. Rows of wooden benches lined the room, and at the far end, Judge Harriet Cole sat high above, her expression unreadable. My parents were already there at the defense table, Richard in a dark suit that looked stiff on him, Linda in a pale blue blouse and skirt that seemed carefully chosen to make her appear softer. Melissa sat between them, her hair pulled back tight, a pale gloss on her lips. She didn't look at me at first, just stared straight ahead, as if I didn't exist. The prosecutor, Marlene Davidson, rose and began laying out the case with a calm confidence that cut through the stillness. She presented the bank transfer records, the signed acknowledgement from my father, and the purchase receipts Franklin had uncovered. Her voice was steady, each fact clicking into place like a lock turning. Bernard Hoffman, my parents' attorney, stood when she was finished. He was broad-shouldered with silver hair and the kind of voice that probably sounded convincing in most rooms. This, Your Honor, is a misunderstanding within a family. These funds were not stolen. They were used with the intention of benefiting everyone, including Miss Carter. My jaw tightened at the way he said my name, like I was a stranger to them. Marlene didn't flinch. Intentions do not change the fact that this money was taken without the rightful recipient's consent. It was earmarked for Miss Carter, not for vacation, home renovations, or boutique funding. Melissa shifted in her seat, finally glancing in my direction. Her eyes caught mine, and for a fleeting second there was something like guilt there. But it was buried under something sharper, a glint that felt almost like defiance. When the judge asked for statements from the defendants, Melissa's voice was quiet but clear. I never intended to steal from Abby. I was told the money was being used for the family's future. I trusted my parents. Richard kept his hands clasped in front of him, his tone controlled. We've always done what we thought was best for our family. This has been blown out of proportion. Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, adding, we only wanted to make things better for everyone. The judge listened without much reaction, her eyes moving between each of them. When she spoke again, her tone left no room for misunderstanding. There is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. A ripple moved through the courtroom. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, forcing myself not to look at them again. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, but my face remained still. As people began to stand and the session adjourned, Marlene leaned toward me. "There's one more thing," she said in a low voice. "We're adding your Uncle David's case from 2017 to the file. It establishes a pattern of financial misconduct which strengthens our position." I felt a small jolt of relief, not because it made victory certain, but because it meant the truth was finally being given its full weight. Outside in the hallway, the air felt warmer, heavier. Melissa passed by with her parents, Bernard walking just behind them. She glanced over her shoulder at me, that same unreadable mix in her eyes. I didn't respond. Grandma touched my arm. "Let's go. There's no reason to stand here watching them walk away." We stepped out into the sunlight, the city noise swelling around us. The courthouse loomed behind, solid and unmoving, while ahead the streets buzzed with people going about their day. I knew this was just one step in a much longer process, but for the first time in months, I felt the ground under my feet steady. The first message came the next morning, a clipped paragraph from my cousin Patricia telling me how ashamed she was that I would drag family matters into a courtroom. She ended it with a line about how Grandma would be heartbroken if she knew I was turning against my own blood. I didn't reply. By the end of the week, there were half a dozen more, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all carrying the same tone of quiet judgment or outright hostility. One night after work, I opened Facebook without thinking and saw Patricia's latest post. It was a photo of her at a charity gala smiling beside Melissa. The caption read, "Some of us still know what family means." The comments were full of little hearts and clapping emojis from relatives who had never once asked me my side of the story. I closed the app and tossed my phone onto the couch, the tightness in my chest making it hard to breathe. Amy noticed before I even said anything. She came by with a bottle of wine and a bag of takeout, settling at my kitchen table like she was planting herself there until I started talking. "They can post all the nonsense they want," she said between bites of lo mein, "but it doesn't change what they did." Brian joined us later, laptop in hand. He had been digging through public property listings and credit card transactions that Franklin had provided. "There's something you need to see," he said, turning the screen toward me. It was a grainy video clip from an Instagram story saved before it could disappear. Melissa was in a sleek, modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Boston skyline. She was holding a glass of champagne, her voice laughing as she said, "When the rent's handled, you can really focus on the decor." The caption tagged a luxury furniture brand. Brian pulled up another file, a credit card statement in Richard's name. Several monthly charges matched the rent for that building. My stomach churned. It wasn't just the money from Grandma they had used. This was a whole lifestyle being propped up on resources that were never theirs to take. I sent the files to Franklin that night. His reply came within minutes. "This will help. Keep looking." At work, the strain was showing. Back in May, before the case took over my life, I had been in line for a promotion to senior project manager. My supervisor had hinted it was practically mine. But between court dates, meetings with Franklin, and the emotional drain of it all, I had taken more personal days than I could afford. 2 weeks ago, they announced the promotion had gone to someone else. I congratulated her with a smile, then went back to my desk and stared at my monitor until my vision blurred. I tried to keep my head down, but whispers had a way of finding me. A colleague forwarded me an email from a vendor who had stumbled on Patricia's Facebook posts and decided to weigh in. It was a single sentence, half pity and half accusation, asking if it was true I had turned on my own parents over money. I deleted it without responding. Still, Amy and Brian kept me moving forward. Every few nights we met at my apartment or a coffee shop, combing through social media posts, public filings, and anything else we could find. Sometimes it felt like trying to piece together a puzzle without knowing what the picture was supposed to look like. Other times, a new detail would snap into place so neatly it made my skin prickle. One rainy Thursday, Amy slid a manila folder across my table. Inside was a printout from a travel booking site showing a week-long stay in Nantucket last November under Linda's name. The total cost was more than my monthly rent. She found this while looking at the credit card history. It's all linked, Abby. They weren't just careless, they thought no one would ever call them on it. I sat back feeling both exhausted and more certain than ever. The apartment video, the travel records, the credit card charges, they were threads in the same web one they had been weaving for years. That night as I washed the dinner dishes, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened kitchen window. The woman staring back looked tired, yes, but there was something else there too. A steadiness. A resolve that hadn't been there before all this began. The phone buzzed on the counter. Another message from Patricia lit the screen, this one shorter than the rest. You'll regret this. I let it fade to black without touching it. Outside, the rain had stopped and the street lamps cast long pale shadows across the sidewalk. I knew the next step was coming, and this time I would be ready. 2 weeks later, I was in Franklin's office when he slid a thin folder across the desk. He didn't look pleased. Their lawyer reached out this morning, he said, tapping the folder with one finger. They want to make a deal. I opened it and scanned the typed page. Richard and Linda would plead to a lesser charge, avoid jail, and pay back $100,000 over 10 years. It felt like an insult dressed up as a compromise. 10 years of slow payments and still only half of what they had taken. I closed the folder and pushed it back to him. Number. That's not enough. Franklin gave a short nod as if he had expected my answer. I'll tell them. That night the air in my apartment felt thicker than usual. I kept replaying the offer in my head, imagining Richard's smug expression when he thought he had outsmarted me again. Half the money and none of the truth. It wasn't justice. It was a rewrite of what had happened, one where they walked away lighter but still whole. 3 days later, a message popped up on my phone from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened it, my chest tightened. It was from Melissa. Abby, I need to talk to you. Please hear me out. Against my better judgment, I typed back one word. What? Her reply came in a flood of messages. She wrote that she was scared, that she had only gone along with what Mom and Dad told her to do, that she had never wanted to hurt me. She said she would testify against them if I agreed to drop the charges against her. She promised she would make it right. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Every part of me wanted to believe that maybe she was telling the truth, that maybe this was the moment she finally chose me over them. But the memory of her eyes at the preliminary hearing came back sharp and clear, part regret, part challenge. I called Franklin instead of replying. I read him her messages word for word. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Do not respond to her directly, he said finally. We will handle this. If she's sincere, it will come out under oath. If she's not, then you just avoided giving them leverage to claim this was all a misunderstanding. The next morning, Franklin confirmed what I had suspected. Melissa's lawyer had contacted the DA's office with the same offer, but their version left out the part about dropping charges against her. Instead, they framed it as her being a cooperative witness from the start. It was a setup, a way to water down her role and make the case look less severe. That knowledge burned in my stomach like bad coffee. She had dangled the idea of reconciliation in front of me, not to mend anything but to save herself. It was the same pattern I had seen my whole life, her getting into trouble and finding a way to step just far enough aside so someone else took the brunt of it. I spent that afternoon going through the evidence again, reminding myself why I had come this far. The bank transfers, the receipts, the photos of her posing in that Skyline apartment, the smug Facebook posts. Every detail was a reminder that this wasn't about sibling rivalry or hurt feelings. It was about theft, deceit, and a belief that the rules didn't apply to them. Late that night, another message from her arrived. This time it was just 3 words. You'll regret it. I didn't answer. Instead, I set my phone face down on the nightstand and let the silence between us grow wide and unbridgeable. Franklin called the following day to say the DA was moving forward without any deals. The court date was locked, and the case would include the new evidence tied to the luxury apartment and the travel records Amy and Brian had uncovered. He sounded confident, almost energized. They are running out of angles, Abby. Stay the course. I promised him I would. And for the first time since this began, I believed I could. Outside, the early evening light was soft and golden, filtering through the blinds. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I knew exactly which way the wind was blowing. The first day of trial dawned gray and cool, the kind of morning that made the city feel quieter than usual. I stood outside the Suffolk County Courthouse, the sound of passing traffic muffled by the thick stone walls behind me. Franklin was beside me, scanning the crowd of people funneling toward the entrance. When we walked inside, the smell of old wood and paper hit me sharp and familiar, and my chest tightened. The courtroom was already half full when we entered. Reporters with notepads in their laps, a few curious locals, and a row of family members who kept their eyes anywhere but on me. Across the aisle, Richard sat stiff in a navy suit, his jaw clenched tight. Linda's hair was pulled back so severely it made her look older, more brittle. Melissa sat between them, her hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the table. When the judge entered the room, Rose then settled again. The prosecutor, Marlene Davidson, stood and began her opening statement. Her voice was steady and clear as she laid out the timeline, the transfers, the receipts, and the witnesses who would testify. She spoke of betrayal within a family, of trust broken for personal gain. Bernard Hoffman, the defense attorney, countered with a story of misunderstanding. He called it a family dispute blown out of proportion, a matter of poor communication, not theft. I kept my face neutral, my hands folded in front of me, but my pulse thudded in my ears. One by one, Marlene brought out the evidence. Copies of bank records, each marked with the dates and amounts of the transfers. Photos from Melissa's social media showing her in expensive restaurants, wearing designer clothes, and vacationing in places she had claimed she could never afford. Franklin had organized every image by date, each one neatly lining up with withdrawals from the account my grandmother had set aside for me. When Uncle David took the stand, his voice was steady. He told the jury about the $60,000 Richard and Linda had taken from him in 2017, how they had promised to pay it back in full, and how only half had ever been returned. His eyes flicked toward me once, and I gave a small nod. Midway through the second day, the air in the courtroom shifted. Melissa was called to testify. She walked to the stand slowly, not looking at me, her face pale. When she was sworn in, there was a long pause before she began speaking. And then, without warning, she said the words I never expected to hear. I took the money. I knew it wasn't mine. I was following what my parents told me, but I didn't stop it. She went further, detailing the conversations in which Richard and Linda had decided to use the funds for the Cape Cod renovations, the car, the store, and the club membership. Her voice wavered when she admitted she had lied in her earlier statements. She looked at the jury once, then back down at her hands. The defense scrambled to control the damage, but it was too late. Marlene's questions guided Melissa through every relevant date, every purchase, every justification they had used. The words landed heavy in the room, and I could feel the weight of them settling into the jury's minds. By the final day, the verdict felt inevitable. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours before filing back in. I watched their faces as the foreperson stood, a sheet of paper in his hand. Richard Langford, guilty of larceny over $120,000. Linda Langford, guilty of larceny over $120,000. Melissa Langford, guilty of larceny over $250, but sentenced under the cooperation agreement. The judge's sentencing was measured but firm. Richard would serve 1 year in the county facility with eligibility for release after 4 months. Linda would serve 6 months of home confinement and 5 years of probation. Melissa would receive a suspended sentence, 300 hours of community service, and the obligation to participate in restitution. All three were ordered to pay back the full amount, with the Cape Cod house to be sold and the proceeds directed to me. There was no cheering, no dramatic gasp from the gallery. Just the scratch of the clerk's pen and the rustle of people gathering their belongings. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw still tight. Linda blinked rapidly but didn't cry. Melissa glanced at me once, a look I couldn't read, before the bailiff led her back toward the side door. When it was over, Franklin touched my arm lightly, guiding me out into the hallway. The noise of the courthouse returned all at once, shuffling feet, muted conversations, the squeak of a rolling cart on tile. We passed reporters clustered near the entrance, their questions hanging in the air unanswered. Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain, the pavement still damp underfoot. The light was softer now, the clouds beginning to break. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, watching the traffic blur past and let the reality of it sink in. The fight was over, at least in the legal sense. I had what was taken from me, and they had been held accountable. Still, there was a hollow space in me that the verdict couldn't fill. Justice didn't erase the years of silence, the small cruelties, the way my own family had looked at me like a stranger. I took a slow breath and started down the steps, the weight on my shoulders lighter than it had been in a long time, but still they're shifting as I moved forward. Morning light pooled across my kitchen counter, the kind of soft brightness that made everything look cleaner and more possible. The window was cracked just enough to let in the sound of a bus sighing to a stop 2 blocks over and the faint clatter of someone walking a dog on the sidewalk below. A stack of paperwork sat beside my coffee mug. At the top was the letter from the loan servicer that I had read at least 10 times, paid in full. I traced the words with my finger as if they might fade if I blinked too long. My apartment was small but entirely mine. I had closed on it in early spring after the restitution cleared and the Cape Cod place sold. The closing day was gray and drizzly, but I did not care. I signed my name, shook the attorney's hand, and carried a single houseplant up 3 flights of stairs, laughing out loud in the empty hallway because there was no one to tell me I was being ridiculous. The first night I slept on a mattress on the floor with a blanket from Grandma folded at the end. The rain hit the windows, and I thought, this is what peace sounds like. Work steadied too. The promotion that had slipped away last year found its way back after the verdict, not out of pity but because I had taken on a campaign no one wanted and dragged it from a stalled mess into something smooth and measurable. My boss called me into a conference room with glass walls and told me the senior project manager role was mine if I wanted it. I said yes before he finished the sentence. When I returned to my desk, Amy texted a string of confetti words without any punctuation, and Brian sent a photo of a cupcake he bought to celebrate for me since I was too busy to leave my chair. Grandma visited the apartment not long after I moved in. She wore her navy sweater set and carried a tin of lemon bars wrapped in wax paper. We sat on the rug and ate them straight from the tin, each bite tasting like the kind of childhood that is warm even when other parts are not. She walked the place slowly, pausing at the window that looked over the street and the maple tree that would turn a bright blaze in October. She said it felt like a good home. She said the walls were honest. I laughed and she squeezed my hand as if to say that sometimes a simple sentence is the truest kind of blessing. The practical pieces of the aftermath did not feel cinematic. They felt like phone calls and signatures and lines of numbers that finally moved in the right direction. The escrow officer emailed when the Cape Cod sale closed and a cashier's check hit the restitution account. The court clerk sent the schedule of payments and the wage garnishment orders. Franklin forwarded confirmations that made me breathe a little easier. Richard served his time and moved to probation. Linda finished home confinement and began community service at a food pantry in Dorchester. Melissa checked in for her hours at a neighborhood center and posted nothing about it anywhere. I did not see my father. I did not want to. My mother asked to meet and I agreed twice across many months, always in public places, always with an ending time set before we began. She spoke of healing and of the way families bend without breaking, as if the bending had not already turned to a snap. I listened, then reminded her of the restitution order and the boundary I could not and would not move. She cried quietly the second time and said she missed me. I believed that she did, and I also believed that love without respect was a costume that did not fit anymore. I saw Melissa once by accident on Boylston Street. She was walking fast, a canvas tote over her shoulder and her hair pulled back into a tight knot. For a second, we both stopped, like people who think they are recognizing versions of each other in a reflection. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it and kept going. My heart thudded and then settled. The space between us was not anger anymore. It was a clean edge that I could hold without cutting my hands. Spring turned to summer. Grandma's birthday came again, this time, quiet and exactly what she wanted. We gathered at her house on a Sunday afternoon. Amy brought a salad with cherries and toasted almonds. Brian brought vinyl records and set one on the player while Grandma shook her head at how he still believed the old things sounded better. I brought flowers from the market and a framed photo from the day I moved in. Just the two of us sitting cross-legged on the rug, lemon bars between us, both of us laughing at something that did not need to be preserved to be remembered. We ate roasted chicken and new potatoes with dill. Sunlight slid across the table and climbed the wall in slow inches. When it was time for cake, we sang, and Grandma closed her eyes before she blew out the candles. She said she did not need wishes anymore. She said she had what she wanted, which was time, decency, and the chance to see the people she loved standing on their own feet. After cake, she took my arm and led me to the little porch. The air held the warmth of a day that would keep the windows open all night. She told me she still spoke to a few relatives who had drifted away during the worst of it. Some were circling back with careful steps. Some would always choose to look away. She said that was not my work to fix. She said the only work I had was to keep living like my choices mattered. On the walk back to my place, I took the longer route past the park where kids were playing in the splash pad and the dog walkers held polite conversations about leashes and summer heat. A young couple was carrying a bookshelf up a stoop, two corners banging against the railing, both of them laughing while they tried to turn it. A woman sat on her stoop with a book and a glass of iced tea and the kind of face that said the chapter was good and the tea was better. Mundane peace can be a miracle when you have forgotten what it looks like. I tucked that thought away for the nights when my chest went tight for no reason at all. I still had moments when the past tried to pull up a chair. The preliminary hearing. The faces in the gallery. The sound of a car door and the click of metal. Sometimes they came without warning. When they did, I let them pass through and out again. My therapist taught me to picture the thought as a leaf on water. To watch it float by without grabbing it. It felt simple. It also felt like learning a new language after years of silence. The apartment changed with me. The mattress left the floor and a bed frame took its place. A small bookshelf stood beside the window, heavy with paperbacks and 2 cookbooks I might actually use. A plant thrived in the corner like it had been waiting all this time for the right light. I framed my degree from Northeastern and hung it in the hallway, not as a trophy but as a reminder that I had built a life one hard thing at a time and I could keep going. On a late summer evening, I stood at that window with the maple tree starting to think about turning. I thought about the lines that had been drawn and the ones I had redrawn. I thought about my grandmother's hands steady over mine at her kitchen table when she told me that protecting me was the same as protecting what our family meant at its best. I understood it in my bones now. Boundaries were not a wall. They were a door that I could choose to open for the people who had earned the right to walk through. I sat on the couch and wrote a note to myself on the back of an old grocery list. Pay attention to the small cruelties. Believe the first time. Trust the people who show up when it is hard. I tucked it into the drawer with the spare keys. Before I turned in for the night, I called Grandma like I always did. She said her knees were giving her trouble, then laughed, and said they had carried her this far, so who was she to complain? She asked what I had for dinner and told me that next time I should come over so she could make something real. We said goodnight, and I listened to the quiet for a minute longer, the kind that does not need to be filled to feel whole. If you have ever had to draw a hard line with people who share your last name, I am thinking of you tonight. If you have found a way to forgive without forgetting, or if you have chosen not to forgive because that is what keeps you safe, I hope you will share how you did it. Tell me where you are listening from and what part of this story sat with you. If this journey spoke to something in your own life, stay with me by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and passing it to someone who might need to hear that choosing yourself and choosing integrity can live in the same like a breath.